Indeed.
Hey Tim, how's it going?
Okay, Ramadan's finished, so we can all drink, binge, smoke, and have sex whenever we want.
Oh, I thought it was only eating that was out.
No, no, well, strictly speaking, there's no public dancing, no drinking, no smoking, no eating in public. The
Wow.
presumption is no sex in public as well, but I made the mistake of going with my then racially disparate partner to a spa, as was our wont, about once every 2 weeks. And this particular one we hadn't been to before, and it was supposed to be a couple's spa.
Hmm.
It happened to be in Ramadan, and it was via a Groupon coupon back when they were physical coupons, and they couldn't supply a couple's room. And therapist came in, said, "It's Ramadan. I'm Muslim. I do not want any trouble from you whatsoever." And it's like, okay, my partner's not in the next therapy table, in the next room. But it's like, well, where did you get that from? And I think she'd also, I can't remember now, but she might have also said, and I've got my period anyway, type thing. And it's like, do I really care? And it was close to being one of the worst massages I've had in Dubai. But yeah, I've had worse elsewhere,
Hmm.
but never mind. But this read was an illumination. Yet more reasons for me not to come to the event. But just to get the awe in the other way, albeit it's slightly on the edge, a friend's meeting house was busted open by the Metropolitan Police, 20 plus, apparently, with some reported carrying tasers, because obviously, under normal circumstances, we don't carry firearms.
Right. What did they post?
And
Did they post a
apparently,
meme on WhatsApp or something?
they, they took away 6 people who were participating in a meeting that was deemed to be pro-Palestinian and pro-climate change, and nothing more. Nobody seems to be finding out anymore.
So you're
And
not allowed. I thought so you're not. So they're the authorities are on Israel's side. Is that what you're saying?
no, it's the you're talking about pro-Palestinian action and
Right.
climate action. Therefore, we want you.
Right.
Now, the previous time that I knew about this, there was a clear and traditional arrest,
Hmm.
and a friend of mine is in prison for it,
Hmm.
and that was organising. Do you know about Just Stop Oil, JSO?
Hmm.
Right. It's obviously the British have got a big slice of the North Sea, along with the Norwegians, etc.
Sure.
And there are parcels of the seabed that they farm out under a license, so you can go and explore and then, in theory, extract oil and gas.
Hmm.
There was an undertaking back when we did COP back in 2012, I think, when it was at Glen Eagles, and the then Minister of the Environment, a American citizen that hadn't surrendered their American citizenship when they became an MP,
That's weird.
first name Boris, was the lead for the COP, and it was said then that we wouldn't issue any more licenses.
Hmm.
We have, and so one of the things that Just Stop Oil have said is ultimately that's killing people. Therefore, we will protest it. So their original set of protests was to sit in a row across the motorway or across the motorway on off-road.
Hmm.
So it froze up the motorway. And subsequently, they've also thrown paint at the plastic cover of some artwork in a gallery, if I remember right. All Roger was doing was organising the next protest via a very early planning meeting as to what could we do that's not the same but different and less inconveniencing for everyday people like sitting on the motorway. There's not a criticism. Almost all of it was outside sort of a left-wing area, but it's like, what if an ambulance needs to get through it?
Right.
The ambulance comes. The ambulance, because we've always got a spare lane with British motorways, the inside emergency lane, which in theory is supposed to be empty. Well, the ambulance will come pairing up there, and they'll clearly be let through. Unfortunately, one or two people that drive, particularly in town, with what we know disparagingly as Chelsea tractors. Chelsea being a very rich area in London, and Chelsea tractors are therefore relatively large 4x4s, normally Range Rovers, which have no real use in the inner city.
Right.
And even I was literally on the outside, 1 mile on the outside of London, 1.1 mile less than the 1 mile. I would have to walk over a footbridge to cross over the M25. I didn't have a car in London. In fact, I only drove inside London when I moved to Bath, and I took a car back.
Sure.
But so a bit like there was a crime thriller thing with Michael Caine, who was supposed to be a New York resident and was suddenly kidnapped and thrown in the driving seat. And he said, "But I don't know how to drive and live in New York. Why would I need to drive?" Anyway, so at one of the smaller JSO protests, somebody with a Range Rover drove through the line. They managed to roll away, but the outer two, or the nearer two to the car, all got a couple of bruises on their shoulders. My knowledge, no action was taken, but there might have been. But we've also had the other extreme with our baby version of the Proud Boys sort of thing, every now and then do a protest. And on the last one that I saw anything of, the cops outnumbered the right-wing tough boys and had to surround them because the left turned up and were out for
to
blood.
protect them. Yeah.
So they were trying to make sure there was no repeat of a Cable Street fracas.
Yeah, the left get kind of unhinged too. I'm kind of glad I don't own a Tesla right now.
I did see a meme that somebody had put up about insurance safety for your Tesla was a Harris Welch for president sticker, which I thought was probably about true.
Right. Yeah. 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 Or something that says F Trump or something like that on it. Yeah. It's
But I also understand, along with Tesla's stock price diving, I understand for some strange reason, because apparently Canada's your biggest orange juice importer, the price of orange juice has crashed. But I haven't been able to recheck that. That was just not so much a meme, but like a statement from somebody that showed a share price graph. It was sort of doing this.
Well, orange juice is a big thing. I mean, there are orange juice futures. It's that. I mean, it's a trade.
Yeah,
it's a commodity that trades on exchanges.
Yeah, there's futures in all the agricultural stuff.
Yeah, all the primary things. But I was surprised to find that out because I would expect it for wheat and corn and soybeans and stuff like that. But OJ was a surprise to me when I was a college student. So yeah. But yeah, I used to. I mean, I had a Tesla for 3 years, and I still have a charger in my garage up north, but I don't have one right now. So I kind of dodged that bullet.
Yeah.
So here we are to talk about Caste.
Before we dive into the book, though.
Okay.
What about the other book that Mark mentioned?
The new one by Ezra Klein.
Well, other than it seems a strange choice of title because there's at least 2 other books with the same one single word title that I know about.
Yeah.
And I can't remember who it was now, but somebody that I follow reasonably ended up with a big falling out with mine. Probably Sam Harris. He's the sort
Yeah.
of person that falls out with people.
Right. I thought Klein actually I liked Klein's first book, that why are we divided, or whatever it was called. I thought he made some good points. And that was, that was like 10 or a dozen years ago, I think. So it came out about at the same time as the idea of filter bubbles, was kind of becoming understood. So I thought that was useful. This one looks like it does. I mean, it looks like it's a bigger scope. I was looking, it was kind of weird because it was blurbed by both Fareed Zakaria and David Brooks in the Amazon ad. Those are both very prominent, which is interesting. It seems kind of short. It's 320 pages. So yeah. So I would be amenable to that. Maybe, I don't know that we could. I guess we should probably wait until Mark is available to talk about it. I don't know that would entice him to come back. And if he's still in Hawaii, to get up at 4 a.m. or 3 in the morning or whatever he would have to do. But yeah, it did look like an interesting book. And actually, my folks, I think, saw an interview. I think Jon Stewart, although I don't think they've only posted clips of it so far. They haven't posted the whole thing, but I guess I'll have to just listen to it as an audio podcast on Spotify. Jon Stewart and Klein had a longish interview in which the clips that they're posting are of Klein explaining all of the steps. That I think the title was Abundance.
Okay.
It's that one from 323 that Mark mentioned. The subtitle is, I guess it's just called Abundance. But apparently in the clip that's becoming very popular on YouTube, Stewart sort of loses his mind at all of the steps involved in the Biden administration.
I must admit, there's been a couple of the Stewart shorter interviews on his Monday edition of whatever the program is that he's had with quite a range of people. One of whom was not what her name is now, but there's the woman president of the EU. She'd obviously must have been in the UN or something for some reason, and sort of wandered into the studio. And it's not apparently the first time she's done the session with Stuart, so that was quite entertaining. And I thought the explaining the numbers, he did one with Steve Ballmer from Bucks, where it was just literally an advert for Steve's website of numbers for the US. And that was quite funny because the usual, when Windows 3.11 came out, I went to one of the UK opening sessions and Steve was doing the session and couldn't get it to run. And in front of about 2,000 people, about 1,000 of whom were journalists and stuff. And
Windows 3.11 was the version just before Windows 386, right?
No, this was after. Windows 3.11 was also known as Windows for Workgroups, so it was also the first one.
Okay.
If I remember rightly, that came with.
Okay, so it already was 64-bit. All right. Yeah, I couldn't place. I remember Windows 3.11. I remember Windows 386. Yeah.
Because there was Windows 286 was the original collapse.
Right.
And then there was Windows 3.1, and that had the ability to make groups on the screen and do all the funny things with colors and stuff and shortcuts. And then 3.11 had a browser for memory. It's not to say it wasn't in 3.1, but anyway.
Was that when they tried to integrate and then they got cut off trying to integrate Internet Explorer into it? No. In any case, it doesn't matter. But
I was like 3 seats behind Guy Kearney, which was the white old bearded guy that was sitting in the green room a few years later at the BBC, and the intern turned left, going to the entrance to pick up somebody. Said, "Are you Guy?" And the guy said, "Yes. Come with me." And the guy came with the intern, sat in a chair, and was going for a job interview. And so he got interviewed about something to do with IT. As though he was Guy Kearney, the old white bearded internet IT journalist who always wore sandals and socks. So there was several identification issues the intern could have picked up on, except the guy that was sitting in the seat answering his questions that he wasn't quite sure. None of it was about a job, but he thought it's the BBC, so they're trying me out. Like
Right.
it's an audition as opposed to an interview.
Mm-hmm.
But this guy called Guy was Guy Goma, about 6'3", black with a very accented Nigerian voice, as opposed to Guy Kearney is about 5'2" and London born and bred sort of thing,
Mm-hmm.
and now dead, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm.
But was a very fast writer.
Mm, I see.
But Chris is still in home too, by the look of it.
Oh yeah. No, I'm still out in a way. 2 weeks, I'm guessing,
Mm.
what they're saying. So we'll see.
That's-
But I at least have a massive hydroxyl generator in the house getting rid of the forest fire smell, which is nice.
Yeah, I saw photos. That's progress.
So I don't know. Oh, going back a second to the abundance book, I can easily see, based on the cover and bits and pieces, there is some overlap with some of our reading of Kimmerer
Mhm.
in reading Sweetgrass and talking about abundance, although my guess is her abundance is dramatically different than his version of abundance.
Yes, I
I'm
would
also
imagine so.
reading a quick snippet of that too, because it looks like it talks about housing and housing shortages versus abundance, and tying it back into this week's reading. It would seem to me that too often when we talk about housing and we need more housing, it's usually we need more housing for the upper castes and
Right.
the white people or the rich people or the dominant people,
Mhm.
and then they'll move from the old places into the new places, which then makes space for the others,
Right,
the
right.
poor, rather than let's build brand new great housing,
Right.
for everyone
Mhm.
who, in every place. And then, we so usually see that issue of the NIMBY, not in my backyard. I don't, even in my
Right.
local neighborhood, one of the things that did survive along the fire border is there's an old hospital, like and it stands out because it's, I don't know, 7 or 8 stories in a neighborhood where everything else is 2 stories at most. But it's been abandoned for years. And the idea has been floated, hey, let's redo this
Mhm.
and make it new housing or
Make it
apartments.
affordable housing or something. Yeah.
And of course, everybody in kind of the rich neighborhood around us is like, oh no, we can't have poor people hanging out. And it's like,
Right. Right.
or bits and pieces of it. I'm obviously generalizing an awful lot here, but
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. It's
and it's an interesting thing to watch too in LA now, because between the Palisades fire and the Eaton fire, you know, more than what's 10,000 structures in Eaton, and almost 14, I think, in Palisades.
wow.
But the rental market has been super heavily impacted, so that now the LA surrounds are one of the most. It was expensive before, but it's
Sure.
10 times worse now
Yeah.
because there's just not enough housing. So it's interesting to see that, while at the same time, there's a judge playing around with what has Los Angeles done with billions of dollars of money designated towards the homeless and the super poor that should be helped there. So you have, a huge tale of the haves and the have-nots, and how do they cope with finding housing.
Right. Right. I'm glancing at the, I'm just sort of scrolling through what's available to look at on Amazon, and it seems like it sort of begins with a lot of the stuff that we talked about, which isn't necessarily an argument against it, but the supply side mistake is a heading, and then it goes on to talk about society is not a pie, so sort of the zero sum argument, and then the positive thing is kind of a liberalism that builds is what he's talking about, and an abundant society. And that's all in the introduction. So I guess and then it's relatively short. That there are only half a dozen chapters, or 5 chapters really: grow, build, govern, invest, deploy, and then a conclusion. So it's really only about 220 pages of text, and then there's 50 pages of notes and index.
Yeah.
So it's very
Well, I see. It seems like and he obviously is a day-to-day writer for other outlets, which
Right.
gives him some platform.
Mhm.
And I know I read some of his stuff, although I'm not always paying attention to, oh, this is an Ezra Klein piece, although his
Right.
name's become more ubiquitous. So I think I notice it more recently. But I am kind of half curious to see or compare his written article, newspaper, magazine articles against what this might be in terms of note taking for those smaller pieces and then how they turn into a bigger piece, if that's a thing, or if his co-writer influenced and it's making this a some kind of more combinatorial piece.
Right. Yeah. On another topic, the other thing that was going on kind of in the community forum was a discussion of Notebook LM. And Mark isn't here to talk about his reaction, his description of it. Anybody else use it?
Actually, there's been a recent update that somebody on YouTube did a pretty good description of, and I thought, oh, that looks quite good. But there's almost the same update seems to have gone on in Perplexity, where months ago you asked Perplexity a question, it's boom, comes back with a answer. But Perplexity's always put in the sort of like a wiki type little bracket thing, although they're grey dots with footnote numbers in for the references. But now Perplexity takes 20, 30 seconds to answer a question. And it tells you on the screen, so that you don't have to sit there watching a spinning whatever. It tells you, I've done a quick search. These are the subtopics. Reading subtopic 1, whatever the topic name is, collecting citations. Next subtopic, and all this. And then it comes up and gives you visually the same sort of answer, which I thought was quite interesting. But it is actually on. I've sort of given up worrying too much about hallucination. But everyone I've fact checked, and I don't use it that often, so it might be on a given question you might get 10 papers, and they might, or 10 articles, and those 10 might have 1 or 2 or 3 references within the bullet note answer, and everyone I've checked has been real. It's not that I check everyone, but I still get, on the odd few times when I decide to use ChatGPT to be an extra Grammarly checker, and then I go, oh, I wonder if there's a citation for that, and it's like a catchphrase or a particular technical term, and say, explain that, and it goes away, explains it, and you check 3 of the cited items, and like one of them doesn't exist. And it's like, oh, okay. So chat is still
pulling from the wrong data set. Yeah. I haven't used ChatGPT for a long time. I have been using Grok a little bit, and I recently used it. Actually, I wanted to add. I realized as I was doing this, my last week's set of primary sources for my students, I realized that I had referred to the Washington farewell address, but I hadn't actually added a source, where it made them read any of it. So I decided I wanted to put some of Washington's farewell address from 1796 into the source readings that they had to do for last week. And but it's 17, 18 pages long, and it's very dense. I mean, he never actually spoke it out loud. It was just published in newspapers and stuff. So I actually asked Brock. I said, I knew the main things. I wanted to have them read something about entangling alliances and have them read something about partisanship and stuff. And so I asked Grok, what are the major themes of the thing, and where do they appear, right? So that I could actually go to those paragraphs. And it gave me a list of like 5 or 6 of the major themes of the thing. And it told me, that the, entangling alliances is in, paragraph 17 to 20, and, and partisanship is here and there. And, so that was helpful. I was able to kind of go in. The thing that I watched a little bit of that video, the Tiago video on Notebook LM, as kind of a tool to use to surface your own ideas. And I gotta say, I was depressed. It was like, dude, you've got nobody to talk to. You've got to have fake AI agents, pretending to discuss your stuff because so few people are actually interested in engaging with it. What is going on?
But I can't remember whether Tiago is one of those people that has put his notebook, as it were, in the public domain. So it's clearly there's a company behind him now, in the sense of he's employing 10 to a dozen people by the sound of it.
Yeah.
So he's clearly having those discussions. But
But he was sort of
If-
making a lot of the idea, I thought, unless I misunderstood what he was doing on the video, of the fact that you could generate agents that would sort of AI agents that would discuss, that would give sort of point counterpoint about your ideas and have a sort of a virtual discussion with them. And I thought
I mean,
that was weird.
there's that Australian something Stapleford, who's a PhD guy in material science.
Oh, not
He
familiar.
does a lot of YouTube videos on particularly on researching tools.
Mhm.
And he did one, I can't remember whether it was LM or not, but he did one recently where his comment was, this is like having a research assistant alongside you in the lab that you could bounce ideas off. It's a real conversation. And it's like, yeah, but it's taking your 350 words or whatever, looking around to see where those words occur and coming back out. And it's like, at what point do they actually truly give you something that you can't see?
Yeah.
And the one the thing that I think on, if you use Obsidian notes, and I'm sure Obsidian's not unique in this, but I don't think there's anything like it in Evernote, for instance, or OneNote. But Obsidian can use, you have to tell it, aliases.
Mhm.
So if you want to talk about COVID, but you might have been snatching all these things off the web that have C19 or the SARS number, etc., or COVID-19, provided you put those in somewhere that these 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 things are equivalent, then the Obsidian search will join them up.
Yeah.
Just in case. And it's like, I know I use C4 in context and C19 in a completely different context. I'm sort of half wondering whether it would ever confuse the two. So it might hallucinate that I need to treat myself with a kilo of C4 just to make sure I don't blow up. But it's and the obvious thing for me in the sort of the citizen science bit that I cover a bit, the one thing that I know that peeves me greatly, well, the two things that peeve me greatly is people that say, oh, and they spell a local name for their white flower or whatever. And they got no idea what the Latin is. And those people that get engineering units wrong. So it's like lowercase k, lowercase w, uppercase h for kilowatt hour. And it's like, dude, get it. Yeah, if you know what you're talking about, or you want to pass that first level, reading age of 8 type thing, get the fucking units right. Because otherwise you end up following NASA and crashing your spacecraft. And because units are easy, whereas common names of plants and even just the English or the British English name for a plant versus its Latin, and the Latin obviously now changes every now and then with all the genetic research going in. So the next thing you know is I don't know, pick one. Chrysanthemum is no longer called chrysanthemum; it's split across 3 different genera.
Oh, really?
But there's Sophie Greason is a cook author. Her dad was a poet and something. Geoffrey Greason. He did a book called The Englishman's Flora, and it was an attempt. I'm not sure how successful. As in, was he successful in 99.999 cases? He went county by county, including the old counties, so places that had disappeared, like Rutland, and collected all the common names for a plant. So you get the Latin name first, then you get a long list of common names within the county, and then next county, and keep going until he gets to the end. And some of them are illustrated with like 1700s woodblock prints that are like out of one of the old style purples. But it's like, even within a county, there might be a dozen names, and 6 of those might be unique for that plant in that county. But then you go to the next plant along, and some of the same semi-unique names repeat, but they're a completely different plant. And if you're really unlucky, you might find but it's related, so it might be the same genus or the same family, or it's absolutely totally different. And the one I fell foul of recently was pine nuts, whatever it is, pine nuts out of the Mediterranean. It gives you those really nice crunchy bits of nuts, but more often in cooking than anything else.
And pesto, sure.
That turned out to be a misspoken one elsewhere. And the next common name for it was pig nut, which obviously was peanuts, and not just peanuts. But it's I mean,
That's an interesting
way
etymology.
back.
Yeah.
So way back, there was a push to say, yeah, how did we get these names? Why have those names? And do they actually have a purpose, as opposed to it's just that there wasn't sufficient organized education. So the cuckoo point, or arum something, vulgaris or italicum, has also got the word stiff in a couple of its other common names, because that's the starch source, pre-potato, for doing all the Elizabethan and the sort of Henry VIII type white ruffle collars. But apparently we never called potato like rough stiff nut in any shape or form, in spite of the fact of being easily accessible starch.
Yeah.
But that came up in conversation because of that American YouTuber, Crime Pays But Botany Doesn't. And
I'm not familiar with that.
he's actually very good. And he's quite a joy to watch sometimes. But he's got a thing about pigs at the moment, because the pigs are digging all his cactus up.
Oh, yeah.
So he's going out hunting.
Yeah, in a week or two, I'll be doing a thing. I'll be doing a little thing in my American history class on getting the pigs out of New York City, because that was a big to do in the, just before the Civil War. They really.
The final thing before we got into the book, was the other book that Mark mentioned, and I recognise the name, but I didn't realise he was talking about a different book to start with. But it's Abundance by Peter Tremaris and somebody else. And it's clearly a completely different sort of abundance.
Yeah.
So cyborg and computing and future industries.
Well, and it seems like maybe this one isn't that far off of that other one, right? There's a lot of this. I mean, it seems like this whole thing is coming out as a project, right? This abundance thing, right? So there's the abundance book that we've been talking about, and then Mark Thompson has a politics of abundance, which seems to have been inspired by the Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson book. And I'm not sure if Mark Thompson doesn't spell his name with a P, so apparently he's not Derek's brother. But then there's another abundance formula by Lucas Vale. And then there's lessons learned from abundance, unlocking the power of progress and innovation. And once again, inspired by Klein and Thompson, by somebody named Tessa Belmont. And then there's
Have they been podcasting for a while on this subject?
apparently, yeah. And then there's an abundance agenda from March 20, also inspired by somebody else named Shannon Hale. There's an exponential technology series, Abundance, the Future is Better Than You Think, which came out, I can't tell exactly from this. But yeah, I mean, the abundance, I mean, the singularity and sort of techno-optimism and all of that, has been sort of predicting this and talking about this, and then Unveiling Abundance, Track What You Truly Desire, which is book 21 of the Millionaires and Success Mindset series. So
yeah, that one sounds more like we're trying to delve into, the popular press, self-help group.
Right.
But let's also not forget Robin Kimmerer's, newer book, Serviceberry, which is also about abundance from a more indigenous perspective too.
Right. And apparently Derek Thompson, while he was working with Ezra Klein on this, he published a book in 2023 called On Work, which is about the history of labor and the future of work. So, and it's apparently from a bunch of Atlantic magazine writers. So, and the Atlantic is in the news this week.
I'm just gonna say, isn't that fake news source where this journalist who's really horrible at
that Goldberg guy, yeah, this character. Yeah.
My wife actually
So the best
other Jonah.
What's that? I'm sorry. Sorry, Chris.
My wife confused him with the other Jonah, who tends to be a more conservative writer, but is also kind of in the anti-Trump space.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting
Well,
that anti-Trump space seems like there's a possibility, at least there's a suspicion that it explains the connection, right? That explains why Jeffrey Goldberg was on this guy's phone when he went ahead and created this signal group, right? Because you can't create a signal group except with people who are already in your contact list. And there are a lot of reasons why somebody might be in your contact list. But one potential of those reasons is that you were a neocon who was making, some type of common cause with a neo-lib, kind of in an end around for the let's get out of wars position that Trump seems to be
but
at least
the
currently
meme from
espousing.
the meme for this week from Facebook is one of our blue flags. Declare yourself safe from being joined to piss poor planned military operations.
Oh. Yeah.
But I understand it's all happened, but I haven't seen any news about the raid.
About what?
I understand the actual raid they were talking about was only a few hours away at the time they were talking about it.
Right.
But I haven't seen any actual news on the success or otherwise.
I haven't read it yet, but I think something dropped today from Taibbi about, it might have been, I think it was from Taibbi, might not have been, about collateral damage. So I think that so far it had been kind of said, well, there were no adverse consequences. It was an astounding success, and everything went right to plan and all of that. I think that as people look, I mean, not unlike anybody else's sort of massive drone and airstrike kind of situations. I think there's going to be collateral damage. But it's the whole it's weird. The whole thing this week it's kind of weird that there's so much news. I mean, it's like day 68 or whatever of the Trump administration, and it just never lets up. Which I guess is one way of looking at that is that it's a busy 100 days.
Well, the black person I thought of when I started reading these eight pillars only has particularly three very highly quotable pieces as an actor on The West Wing. Because we're going to get a quote in, right?
Oh yeah. So who's this black person you thought of?
And I can't now quite remember why it struck. Just as you have a pillar number one and its intro with all the divine will and the laws of nature. So it must have been the laws of nature that gave me this. We measure the success of a mission by two things. Was it successful, and how few civilians did we hurt?
Right.
They measure success by how many. Pregnant women are delivering bombs, and you're talking to me about international law? The laws of nature don't even apply. I've been a soldier for 38 years. I've been a soldier for 38 years, and it's an admiral from the Navy. And that always struck me as a blue bar. And I found an enemy I can kill. He can't cancel Sharif Strip, Leo. You've got to tell him he can't cancel it. And that's all in that section about We Killed Yamamoto. Season 2, episode 22. It's the one that sticks in my mind. I just wish it was the midterms. I just wish it was the midterms one with Glenn Close becoming the first woman to sit on the Supreme Court, but never mind. But for the same way of linking that back to the laws of nature and the current occupant of 1600, it was just the other place that should be quotable so much. And that one comes up. Does anybody know Bush's 8 words that will just into this war with Iraq? Nobody answers. How many of you know my wife's name? Everybody's hand goes up. And that's the Valerie de Plane Fair made into Fair Game, the film. And it's Sean Penn playing the Ambassador Wilson, who went to try and find all the uranium that was supposedly going into the weapons of mass destruction.
Oh.
And the bit that came to mind there was who lied to the UN, Colin Powell. a black man.
Oh, well, and he brings his little vial of anthrax too later and shakes it around.
At which point you have to wonder about the security on the building as to how did it allow anthrax.
Right.
But it could have been talcum powder for all we know.
Could have all been talcum powder.
Although, Colin Powell walks into my room with a vial of anthrax. Like, he's the one guy who can get away with doing that anywhere he wants to go because he's Colin Powell.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah.
Nobody's going to stop and frisk him walking into the UN, really. So,
right. Right. So these pillars that we're kind of on here. One of them that sort of jumped out at me was the endogamy one, pillar number 3.
Yeah.
Because I've been hearing about that. I was hearing about that in the David Wright book about how endogamy in India goes back in these these very small jati groupings goes way back, goes centuries or millennia back. But then also I've sort of run into it. My mother had I've been reading, and she told me about this book here, James Bradley's book, the China Mirage. The Hidden History of the American Disaster in Asia. And she had been reading that. So I started listening to it, and I got a used copy because it names a lot of names, right? The first 2-3 chapters are about opium and in China. And I'm really very much about the American interest in opium in China, and and Russell and Company, and Warren Delano Jr., right, who was the grandfather of FDR. And because Franklin Roosevelt's father, James, died when he was only 16 or 18 years old, I think, maybe even younger. And he didn't really have any Roosevelt cousins. He grew up with, this dozen or so Delano cousins, and he kind of grew up at the knees of his maternal grandfather, Warren Delano, and really kind of thought of himself as a Delano. And it's interesting because I thought, okay, this is another one of those things. I was thinking that in my, in this Obsidian-based web thing that I'm doing for U.S. history, I would start to add, some families, because it talks about the Delanos, and and the Delanos came over in the third boat in 1623. The first Delano ancestor came to Plymouth. So he wasn't a Mayflower person exactly, but very darn close. And and then it talks about the Perkinses and the Russells and the Forbeses, right, and all of these old American families. And I just thought, yeah, we think of somebody like Franklin Roosevelt, right, as, I guess people understood him as being sort of generically elite, right? But I don't think necessarily understood him, and I don't think that history necessarily understands him as, just as being part of this line, right, that goes that far back. And and actually, apparently, there's a funny quote that ends one of these early chapters in this book, where in which FDR says to Henry Morgenthau, his Treasury Secretary, Morgenthau's trying to tell him something about China. FDR cuts him off and says, I have a century or more of experience with China, which of course he doesn't at all. Right? He has all he knows is these family stories about his grandfather, Warren Delano, and his mother Sarah, who was, went to Hong Kong for a little while when she was a little girl, right? And this is his idea that he understands something about China and Chinese history. And and Warren Delano, of course, always lied about his interest in China. It was never about opium. It was about tea and porcelain and all of these other commodities that they supposedly traded in, right? So this whole thing it's just like a well, that's a good point. Henry Adams, yeah, that would be kind of a good thing to look at as well. And actually Ralph Waldo Emerson was married to a Delano woman, I believe. But yeah, so these things, these fingers go out in all these different directions. I thought, well, and I have, over 700 kind of entries in a database that I was kind of putting together in Obsidian about the Gilded Age, and I was thinking, well, I've got to find a way to start bringing these things over. Not necessarily, and I was thinking about it. It's sort of like, well, okay, that gets to be very pointed, right? I definitely have a point of view about the Gilded Age and about these families, and so I've been thinking.
Are you also tracking the cast of all the players and how they relate, particularly as more and more immigrants come in? Because this week I found myself even thinking about, small things like, always nudging our daughter to, be able to use the right fork or the right spoon at a full table setting.
Mm-hmm.
so that, she can fit in with the upper class when she finds herself in those situations, that,
Yeah, right.
the small little social markers that say, hey, I'm this class or that class, or
Hmm.
although these days it's all the nouveau riche and they're just déclassé from top to
Right.
bottom.
Right. Right. Yeah, but which wine for which course and things like that.
So, so when are you putting me escargot clamp on the table?
Right. So I was thinking, so I was thinking, how am I going to deal with this? I don't, I don't want to necessarily, I want it to be, also kind of, I want it to include social history as well, right? So that people who don't, aren't part of these lineages and, and all of that have, some type of, are recognized in the history. But at the same time, I sort of feel like I'm going to put these families in. I'm not necessarily going to tell people what to think about them, but I'm going to put them in and link them, so that when people in U.S. history too read about FDR, they have some links to his family tree, right, and have some kind of an understanding, how long the the I mean, all of these, and it's kind of funny because all of these lists, like the 400 in New York, Mrs. Astor's 400, or the Knickerbockers, right, or the members of the Cincinnati Society of the Cincinnati, or just all of these.
But you also have to compare it and contrast it too with the people at the lower end whose family histories were entirely erased.
Sure.
They just don't exist
Hmm.
at the other end. And it's incredibly hard, even trying to use census records to try and recreate, although, genetic data is helpful in some of those cases, although at the same time, obviously, with 23andMe going bankrupt, that is kind of becomes a problematic question of how do you do that?
Yeah.
And because of both this book and the 23andMe thing, and you bring up endogamy, I had been spending the last couple weeks thinking about the idea of moiety in a lot of indigenous cultures.
Hmm.
So moiety is a very anthropological word that's used in many cultures to describe your parentage and your lineage. But from what I can tell, it's rarely ever used in a caste setting to say this person from this moiety is a higher rank than some other
Right.
person.
Right.
And
Yeah. Yeah. Because
usually,
because typically the things that you hear about are that the people on the left side of the village bury the dead of the people on the right side and vice versa. Right. So
yeah,
neither of them are untouchables who are disqualified by, touching the dead or anything like that.
but it's in some American indigenous cultures, moieties are tracked by animals,
Plants.
or plants or various names, so that
Yeah.
you
The
have
Bear Clan,
names
right? The
attached
Wolf
to
Clan.
it. So
Yeah.
you're part of the Bear Clan versus the Beaver Clan. But
Hmm.
generally, from what I can tell, more often than not, those moieties are imprinted on cultures really more to track your genetic heritage, so that you're not marrying your first cousin and
Hmm.
causing issues.
Hmm.
And there aren't a lot of sources that I've seen that kind of bring it out and say this is why they're doing it. Although at the same time, in cases where, one moiety may bury another's dead, it may in part be a means of being kinder to how do you help one side of your tribe,
Hmm.
grieve and make it easier to
Hmm.
do that kind of hard work for burying people that aren't as super close to you, which is a whole other thing.
Hmm.
And it strikes me that indigenous societies that were much closer and had closer kinship ties created these structures over millennia, in some sense, to keep an even keel power base, to not allow certain groups to have power over others. And
Hmm.
instead, they focused on having power with each other
Right.
as a
Right.
community to help the community survive and thrive and get by,
Right.
versus in a much more hierarchical capitalist society, we don't we either don't have those structures or have totally erased them and created things like caste to create some semblance of normalcy in a power structure. And it's only gotten worse.
Right.
I've been dipping in and out of the weird thesis, the Western educated, industrialized, thing, which I think we've mentioned before.
Hmm.
And that structure, the Catholic Church and other churches have slowly taken who you can marry from 6 or 7 relations out to, only 1 or 2. which also tends to make our families much more nuclear and less spread
Right.
out. I don't hang out with all my, you know, 400 cousins and second cousins are not part of my family, which
Hmm.
is good that it doesn't create, some of the nepotistic corruption that you see in, or let's say early 1900s New York politics.
Hmm. Yeah,
But
but
you're now also seeing within the Trump family and extended families,
mhm.
like we can show preference to
Sure.
family again.
Right. Well, it also has to do with that sort of, never go against the family, Fredo kind of thing, right? That there is some type of a level of trust. But the thing about the thing that strikes me about the moiety thing is what David Graeber and Wengrow said about it is that it extended across the entire continent, right? So if in that world where you could sort of escape being dominated by kind of bugging out and going somewhere else, right? You could wherever you went, you could find a member of the Wolf Clan, right? That would have an obligation of hospitality to
Yeah.
you. Yeah. So there's that element that sort of, but of course it's easier in a society that doesn't accumulate wealth, right? To have that type of kind of social harmony and to have that kind of equalization.
Yeah.
So maybe the
No, and when you compare that to her discussion of, I can go to India and watch people in groups
Mhm.
and know immediately what the caste structure is without knowing any of the names, where the people are from, but I can just watch the interactions and know this person ranks higher than this person, which to
Yeah.
me
Did you
was,
completely buy that?
I, I could totally buy that.
Okay.
And particularly in a society where it's super structured,
Yeah.
or even, and I think in that same section too, she talks about, listening to a group of women kind of idle chatter. Where are you from? Where are their families from? Oh no, we're Nordic, as a means of subtly. And, it's one of those things. I do some of that, although I tend to do it to figure out. So, as background, I grew up in the deeper rural South and
Hmm.
have the ability to code switch to the deepest, thickest accent you've ever heard. But it also tends to mark me as, you know, lesser than, uneducated, not part of the bigger world. So I very quickly learned to not have that accent and have a
Hmm.
generic East Coast or even Midwest.
Right.
And I can subtly even shift my accents to match the people who are around me.
Hmm.
And it's very, very rarely does anybody notice that I do that to fit
Yeah.
in with them.
Mirroring. Yeah.
But
I,
I'll
I
mirror,
I I learned to do that as a salesman.
but I'll ask, usually I can hear, particularly in the deep South, I can hear your accent. And just solely based on your accent, I can guess within a 20 or 30-minute radius of where you grew up.
Hmm.
And
Henry Higgins.
I do it more because I'm interested in the linguistic piece rather than I'm interested in, either the specific culture or where you fit class wise. But
Hmm.
there also are very marked accents in the South that will mark you as either upper crust South versus, the lower classes as well.
Hmm.
So if and I remember talking to Tom Johnson once, who was the head of CNN, and he has a Southern lilt, but he has a super high register. I come from wealth Southern lilt that
Mm-hmm.
is not super common even in the South.
Wow.
But so things like that, I'll clock and I guess it's the internal anthropologist in me that notices it more than the
Hmm.
I'm out to figure out where you fit in the pecking order
Right.
sort of means.
Right. Yeah. It's kind of funny because the where what you use for the pecking order for sort of designating insiders and outsiders is interesting as well, right? My parents, I think, no, they weren't the only ones, but my parents were relatively rare in both of their families for marrying other Italians. And even so, there was a little bit of friction because my mother's parents thought that my father was too far
Yep.
down the social, they were, from peasants and the Colettis were from kind of professional class at least, and so there was a little bit of that, but they were both Italian. A lot of my uncles and aunts married Irish, right? Well, why Irish? Because Catholic, you know, and so there are these sort of categories.
Well, but then it was also at a time in America where, you know, at least among certain classes of people, there was the idea of this is the land of opportunity. We can grow and become better and have more than we did back in the old country.
Right.
Whether we moved here because we were poor or rich or were pushed out or whatever that thing was.
Mhm. Right. They'll
You know,
speak English in the home and all of that. Yep.
you know, I was watching, you know, some early Sinead O'Connor singing about the famine for the Irish, and you know, the lyrics. There was no famine. They were taking all the good food, and we only had potatoes. So we left to get something better.
Mhm.
You know, they essentially were stealing not only our food but our language, and you know, it's supercharged political stuff, even for what you know the early '90s. Like,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
people were up in arms. You know, it's one thing to sing that, or it's another to go on Saturday Night Live and rip up a picture of the Pope. Like,
Right.
what is going on?
Right. It was
Uh,
ironically, yeah. I mean, there were about 3 million Irish who subsisted on potatoes and milk,
yeah.
of a total population of about 8 million, which dropped, you know, to 4 pretty rapidly during the, you know, the 1840s, and then has never recovered because the Irish population is still like 4.8 million.
Yeah.
But
It's a very empty place.
yeah. Yeah. So, but that was partially, I mean, there was partially a population boom after potatoes. So you know, she's not wrong that they took better stuff, but they also, you know, but the growing of potatoes also did create this population bubble in Ireland that had never sort of previously existed. So it's
That
complicated.
kind of on towards the end, and they were talking about the Noah story and the three sons. So you end up with Jews went west, and then Europeans in theory, I suppose, and those that went south or east became all the other Arabs and all the Palestinians and all the rest of it, such that those linkages are the sensible ones went west. And there was a book by somebody else recommendation that came. It's doing a series of recommendations on why Europe dominates. And there was one that came up this week. I sort of half recognised the cover. Well, and it literally tries to go through exactly why, obviously, Europeans as Europeans, plus all the wasps that we sent your direction. And it was all down to how small a clan. I think I actually used the word clan at one point. That gives such a high degree of competition in Europe. And it was literally thinking, oh, wait a minute, wasn't that long ago we've been talking about Columbus, amongst others, you know, Genoa. How big was Genoa at the time of Columbus? And it was in like 3 different bits with a bunch of other people in between. So it wasn't even a continuous piece of northwestern Italy. And then somewhere along those lines, somebody reproduced an 1870s something high school matriculation exam from the US. And it said, name all the republics in Europe. So I thought, wait a minute, I didn't really live in the 1870s. I'm not quite that old. But it's like, so what's the republic? And the first one that obviously comes off the top of the head was Spain. And it's like, was it? When did it become a republic? And I mean, it's like, well, it must be Italy. No, the only big one was France. And there were a couple of dozen.
Venice, the Dutch. Yeah.
Oh, the Dutch might have been, but they're now back into a monarchy.
Right.
So,
but in 1870, in 1870, somebody
Yeah,
went, well, okay, so the American founders, you know, when they looked back and they thought about republics, right? They thought about the Dutch Republic was still extant at that time, and you know, and the Venetian,
France,
Genovese, you know, republics and the Milanese or the Italy.
And in the same process, looking at the various
Switzerland.
small bits of Italy, what is now Italy, the event also came up, which I hadn't clocked before, that the Doge isn't solely for Venice. The Venetian Doge was solely for Venice, but a lot of the other things were actually republics, but not quite, and all the rest of it, were also ruled by somebody who was called a Doge. And then literally, it's okay, take this. So what's left? And it was like, there is a quirk from a build up of Germany versus France as republic, as a country rather. There's a few hundred acres that are on the border of Belgium, Germany, and France that was originally ruled post Napoleon by the British and the Prussians. But the British bit's now been given to Belgium, so, and it's like a train station and 25 people or something. And it's a non-monarchy, non-republic.
Oh, so like the mouse that roared.
Mandate, a bit like sort of Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, and Jordan was, and here, for instance, even trucial states was a British mandate by force rather than anything else. But I got quite exercised about the way that the first pillar, particularly, was all on. So how white you have to be white, and it's like, because I think about the British standard relative to racism. Irish aren't white because they're Catholic, right. So therefore, Spanish and Italians aren't white because they're Catholic,
right.
But Greeks aren't Catholic. But the slang name for them is bubble and squeak.
Is what?
It's bubble and squeak. Bubble and squeak.
Oh, in
Cockney rhyming slang.
Right.
And there's no recognition of the other Mediterraneans, as in the Berbers and the Arabs, the Jews and all the rest of it. And it's like, who would the working class Brit who was isolated, let's say back Victorian times, back in this school period, what else would they know? And they might know a bit of ancient Roman history because Julius Caesar's quite big for Brits. So Numidians, Queen of Sheba, sorry, but they're black, right? And then of course we then know things like the Mahdi and the Sudanese, black, because of Gordon and cartoon. It's about that period.
But what about the Jews of Spitalfields, right? They were kind of famous.
Yeah, well, that was
people, though, right? That
was the other thing is in spite of me walking around London a lot, there doesn't seem to be quite the same ghetto level that you see. I saw, for instance, in Prague. So you go down to the main opera house, and there's like a bend in the river, and from the opera house to the river along is a very Jewish house. And in spite of what Germany did to it, there is actually quite a nice looking old, I don't know how old, but old looking synagogue with a lot of the usual paintwork on the outside. So there's Hebrew scripts and clearly stylized stuff on the inside. And so there's a couple of areas where you get to see people who are very, very clearly Jewish. Ringlets and the fedora hats. And it's like every other church building isn't a church, it's a synagogue. And so a lot of the time they look like a church without a spire or a church without a tower. So they're clearly not Anglican, and they're not really Catholic. But they would easily pass, and they may even be originally a Baptist church or a Methodist church, just as easily. But they're clearly a place of worship, and there's other stuff around. And it's like, I go from for instance, my client from Geneva, his Jewish, and he talks to his father on the phone in Hebrew, talks to his brother on the phone in Turkish, because he's ex-Spanish Jew that went to the Ottomans after the Reconquista. And his other big skill is he forgets to speak to me in English, so he tries French. But the Italian secretary always gets spoken to in Italian, and the German contractors get spoken in German. And he just flips, with no break.
Wow.
And then he realizes I'm looking at him with a bit of a dumb and saying, "Could you say that slower?"
Well, I thought that was just that you always had a dumb look, Tim.
Well, he did,
I'm the same way, so you know.
he's in Geneva, so it's the bulk of the people are French speaking. He drew the line at being able to speak to the Serbs and the Croats who were the original electricians. But the one person who was a problem was the new guy from IBM, who had got IBM corporate language, i.e. English, underway, whose only other second language, as opposed to being German, was Russian, because he was East German. But it was if you looked at the person, what would you say? And oddly enough, when I was reading a bit of that section a few days ago, I was looking at a mixed race marriage. There was a very definite white European who had got a non-Aryan, brown, Indian type of person, or South Asian. And their kids had clearly not been out in the sunshine this year yet. And they were much more white than I expected. But I know from my Palestinian brother-in-law that when he spends most of his time in London and would pass as white. But he and I had a week or so down in Sierra Nevada, Granada, and he very quickly went black, deep brown in the sunshine.
I'm looking forward to getting some sunshine.
I'm sure you are.
Back to my regular hue.
Yeah, and it was sufficient that it was a problem coming back into the UK with passport. Mostly because I got all the passports in my back pocket and mine in my hand, and was going to leave them stranded. But it's clearly at the extremes. You get an original high Dutch, Amish white guy, blonde hair, out of Switzerland, or a Swede type. I mean, you put him next to a Spaniard or a Italian or a Greek, who's got the ability to turn up really well.
Yep.
What are you going to do? They don't look. They might look Caucasian, but they're not white.
Right.
And it also sort of reminded me of the racism that was clear in James Cavell's books of the Asian saga, of which I'm not that sure whether that was Cavell or was him saying, this is what I was believing was being said, and I could well believe it would be said. And I've been questioned as to why you're going out with that ethnic Chinese person. What's she to you? But here, and somewhere like Singapore, it's not that much of a problem. The women still get their bumps pinched, but it's not that, it's not a racist problem.
Yeah.
Because it's everybody gets on here. Yet we're walking around Prague or we're walking around Istanbul, and it's, does she work for you? I mean, at one point, even the one time we got some racism here, was she was doing the washing down of her steps to the patio. So she's in a junky t-shirt and shorts doing the washing down. And she got a complaint from her neighbour who was underneath. We were in 2-floor apartments, but the ground floor is one apartment, the first floor is another apartment. And so she said, because they'd seen me going in and out so much, they thought, it's my apartment. And they said, they want to speak to you. I said, who's that? It's the Arab family down there. So I went downstairs and said, I understand there's a problem. And I got treated like a lord, coffee, tea, dates, bit of bread, hummus, and all the rest of it. And we're not quite sure how to say this, but can you make sure your maid doesn't wash the floors when we got washing out? Because it dripped down over the washing. So I said, well, actually, that's my work colleague. It's her flat. And she's director of finance, multinational, 40,000 person company. You might want to try and make sure that while she started doing the washing of the floors, you don't put the washing out partway through. It's only like, and I know she does it like once every 2 to 3 weeks. It's an accident. And they were absolutely flabbergasted that because she was wet wearing this tatty old t-shirt and shorts and stuff,
Right.
doing maid's work.
Right, doing maid's work. Yeah. Well, and that's
Yeah.
the, I mean, and that's a thing, right? That the things that we do, I mean, and that's and actually, to kind of get back to what Wilkerson is talking about, a lot of that in India came from, that sort of thing. The type of work that you do is determined by your caste, right? So that
Yeah.
you wouldn't allow yourself to be seen, if you were in an upper caste doing
Well,
that.
back at the hotel, there was a couple of people, a couple of teams that did semi-formal paid tours of back of house.
Mhm.
And it then turned out this Swiss family spoke to the person that was arranging a back of house tour, all the fish tanks and stuff. Is there somebody we could talk to about the engineering? Because our daughter, who was like 20 something, was looking to become a facilities manager, facilities engineer. Yes, the senior fish person says, we know Tim. He does our engineering. So I could have delegated it, but I wasn't quite sure. So at the end of a tour, at the end of a fish tour, they gave the girl from the Philippines who's the tour guide. Her primary thing is, I know all the way around the front of the house and all the way around the back of the house, and I speak multiple languages.
Mhm.
The people from Swiss spoke English, so I wasn't a problem. And they gave her a tip of like 20 dirhams. 20 dirhams is $6. And so I said, so what do you want to see? Because we haven't got a route, because we don't do this sort of thing. But since you've asked particularly, I'm happy to show you around. And I've got a bunch of keys, because all the engineering stuff is on mechanical keys as opposed to swipe down.
Mhm.
And at the end of this tour, they gave me a tip of 20 dirham. So I went back to the fish girl and said, oh, by the way, here's the other part of a tip. She says, no, that's yours. I said, no, it's the time it took me. I earned more than this. Don't worry about it.
Right.
So she got a double tip that time. But it was and she doesn't have a business card that says director of engineering or anything.
Mhm.
And I'd given mine just in case they decided there was a follow-up question later. And so it's like, do you really think that, I'm here saving $10 million a year on the energy budget? So that's like 60 million dirhams. Do you really, 30 million, 35 million dirhams. Do you think this guy really deserves 20
Right.
as a,
Buy me a
yeah, but it was,
Well, and that's the thing is the form that it would take would have a different meaning, right?
yeah. So that pushes us into the inheritability bit, I think, because that's once you've been tagged. Obviously, at some point, there was no caste system in your one. But it's like, well, what do you do? Oh, I bury the dead. Okay, clearly you're untouchable.
Right.
And clearly also, back then, there is a practical thing there. And there's no theory of disease, no theory of bacteria, no theory of how diseases transmit, other than we don't necessarily just catch it by sniffing the air type thing.
Right.
So once you're tagged as being the dustman or putting the bodies away in a hole or putting them up on a platform for the vultures to come and eat, that rather stops you doing, oh, I'm going to make butter and hand put it into a bucket for you.
Mhm.
And you can think of some of the things where there's a sort of overlap.
Well, yeah,
Things like
there are hygiene
collecting-
things, there are food things, there are all
but it's
those
like
kinds of
like
things that go
things like
back in all these ancient traditions. Yeah.
but like things like collecting the night soil and then spreading it on the fields. At what point does a clean farmer who then harvests
Mhm.
is allowed back? None of that's come up particularly, but you can imagine some of those conversation type things going on. And Then, of course, there's all the sort of Leviticus type Exodus parts of the Bible about what plant goes where and
Right.
all the rest of it.
Well,
And
my favorite one is the mixing fabrics.
yeah, yeah. So clearly, the Washington Redskins can't play football before you get the quote. But with some of the other bit that came through the inheritability, it might have actually gone into part 3. Can't quite remember. Was you're my chattel, bend over because I feel like some exercise and get pregnant. Your kid's my chattel. Yet further down, maybe a chapter away or something, you've got this guy that got flogged in front of the Negroes because he had sex with one of his, either his slave or his neighbor's slave.
See, the way I interpreted that was different, was that the reason that he was flogged was because he was closer in class to the black enslaved woman, right? So that was that type of consorting with people of similar class thing that wouldn't have been as much of an infraction if it had been clearly an owner.
Yeah, but the second instance that they were talking about was it wasn't his slave, it was somebody else. And so that then brought me down to the conversations that are recorded on some of a minute, but 1 minute remained after the Wannsee conference as to how much of a Jew do you have to be or consult with before you're also tainted with you're on the wrong side of the boundary line. You just might get on a train,
right,
or worse,
right.
And that, as I said before we formally started with 3 people or more, would mean that on the basis of Asians, Arabs, Indians, Africans, slaves, and at what point do we class other Europeans as being below the line? As a WASP, would I get put in jail or flogged or whatever in Alabama? What did seem odd was the time to which it took to take that out of all 50 states, and the fact that once it was taken out, the referendum that took it out, there was still 40+% saying it should stay.
Yeah.
At least you got 40+% as opposed to 49.5 versus 50.5.
Right.
But I could see that with what I know of the 50s and 60s, that would be tight.
Yeah.
And but there is still the fact that then I go, what's the complication? In Alabama, I can't, when we use that one because that was the one that changed the law last, I can't marry a black woman. But if I'm in New York and I've married a black woman, my marriage must be valid in Alabama. So if I visit, am I breaking the law? Or if I'm stupid enough to move, so therefore I'm no longer a citizen of New York, I'm now a citizen of Alabama.
Right.
At what point does the state versus federal, and even down to, does any of this start to become city, county, etc., driven?
Right.
Because I'm sure there must be areas, blue versus red, districts,
right,
not just states.
Well, and before slavery ended, there were some cities in the South where there was not a large, but at least a noticeable number of free black people, and there was in a little district.
So are you saying that the marriage thing was driven by slave versus free, or white versus black?
No, it was driven by white versus black. The thing, it's interesting though, because a lot of that, you mean when it began, a lot of it when it began was driven by in the 1670s, was driven by Bacon's Rebellion in 1676, when when poor whites, many indentured people, and enslaved black people rebelled together, and they were some of the last to give in at the end of that rebellion, because Nathaniel Bacon died of dysentery very early on, or drunkenness. Some people debate that still.
It's all the same back then.
Yeah, right. And it took a while for especially out in the sticks, for the authorities to wrap up that rebellion. And the last people to kind of give in were these mixed groups of enslaved black people and indentured white people. And so the authorities in Jamestown decided we really got to separate these people and find a way to prevent them from identifying with each other on the basis of their treatment and the life that they're living, rather, and so they created this distinction, right? And that's when you get, partus ventrum sequitur and all of that.
These rebellions were not just on too much tax for various white people or whatever, or I don't get a vote because I don't have $50 in your pocket.
Well, this particular rebellion was about expanding at the expense of the Indians.
Yeah, but this presumably overlaps with the same things that were going on in Haiti, etc., where the slaves had managed successfully to rebel against France.
Yeah. Well, that was that was quite a bit later, but yeah, I mean there are and there's a lot of fear in the South after that happens.
Yes, yeah, I could well imagine, because they've just beaten supposedly the world, single dominating military force. It just can't stand the coalition. But,
just a decade earlier, Lord Dunmore is offering freedom to enslaved people who come over to the English side during the Revolution.
Yeah. I thought the New York restaurant and Forest Whitaker guy was really, you don't recognise him, whereby, because he went in and there was a big queue and he turned around and went straight out, or tried
right, yeah.
And then the staff member, presumably the sort of European staff member, decided not to let him out until he'd searched them, and then it's like, you do realise who this is,
right?
He's the King of Scotland after all.
But your story too, Tim, of both the class and race and who can you hit or who can you punish, reminds me of a really incredible, well-known example, but understudied for its cultural context. But the story of Jesus saying, turn the other cheek, has a deeper cultural meaning that most people miss, because in that context, there was a left hand, right hand being clean or unclean. So typically when you were hit, it was a class and origin kind of distinction. I have power over you, so I'm going to hit you. Mm-hmm. But you would hit and strike with the backside of your right hand against one cheek. So the admonition to turn the other cheek, saying, hit me over here, requires you then to hit not with the lower. It's a shaming thing to hit somebody with the back of your hand, but it's a power thing to hit them with the front side of your right hand, which you have to do if the cheek is turned. But the other thing that is inherent in that culture at that time is, by hitting them front hand with the front of your fist or the front of your hand, indicates that they are at the same power level that you are and you're equals. So to hit somebody with the front of your hand says we're equals.
Interesting.
By turning your other cheek, you're forcing them to say we're equals, which they're not going to do.
Well, that's almost like what Graeber's talking about in debt. That relationship is one changes.
The left and right hand here is left hand's dirty, right hand's clean. Because the right hand is what you use to hold the tray in the restaurant, and you still use your left hand to dry your bum or wipe your ass, etc. Mm-hmm. But when you see some of the more, I'm going to say village-based type Pakistani Afghanis, you see them when they're at, because it's just finishing Ramadan, a lot of the mosques give out food for like 300 or 400 people at once, and it's almost all male because that's the population here, and it's all of the poorer workers, and they all have this ability with one hand to tear flatbread into pieces to then use it as the knife, fork, and spoon, because they don't use knife, fork, and spoon. the typical
They can't use it.
Indian.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's like you watch them for a while, then you go, I need to practice that. Uh, in terms of how to use just one hand to tear up bread.
Mhm.
And my Hindu supervisor for the kitchen equipment was an Indian Hindu that came from Pakistan. His comment was, if they went out to the tribal areas and did this with the bread, break bread, they'd shoot you.
Yeah.
And how much of an exaggeration? I don't know, as opposed to the same sort of story of, my first time east of Suez and being offered pork during Ramadan from a Muslim family.
Mm.
They made sure that the houseboy didn't touch the plates or the hand, but took the plate from me with his hand inside a big bag so he could do that and
Mhm.
take it away. So although the giving was a little bit more difficult, the taking away was relatively easy.
Right.
You wonder about those sorts of things when you then come back and say, like, Amish type plain clothes.
Mhm.
It's a single thread, it's wool or it's cotton. You might wear wool and cotton, but it'd be different pieces. And then the other thing that I've seen it, I've recognised it, but I haven't blocked it as a thing. That even some of the details are, you don't put extra cuffs. And are you old Amish or the newer Amish? Newer Amish use things that are clearly totally despicable called buttons, whereas the old Amish
Oh,
don't.
Mennonites. Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And do full-strong buggy or electric motor or electric push bike
Right.
is allowable, but not a car. But
Right. But they
the
have
newer brethren.
there's
using
a
cars.
certain amount of kind of privilege associated with being able to do some of these things, right? Like imagine, if you have to have two sets of cookware in a kitchen, right? There's a certain kind of capital requirement that goes into, that being a thing.
Why 2 sets?
My
Well,
whole kitchen is trafe, which is the technical word for Jewish households that have, things that are all kosher.
Mhm.
You have a kosher set, and then you have another portion of your space that's not kosher.
Right.
And even in some places in Los Angeles, there is such a heavy Jewish culture that there still are what are known as Shabbos goys, who, and I think the last time I at least clocked one or noticed one was on the Sabbath at Cedar Sinai Hospital. They had someone who would literally come in and push the elevator button
Mhm.
for the religious observant, so that
Right.
you didn't have to do the work of
You
pushing
wouldn't have to
the
operate
elevator
machinery.
button
Yeah.
to go into the hospital.
Oh.
And that's, I saw it and I was like, that's kind of odd. That I was like, and at first I thought, oh, and Cedar Sinai is in a very wealthy portion of Beverly Hills. And, if you're Steven Spielberg, that's probably where you're going for your health care if
Mhm.
you're going to be in the hospital. So there's some incredibly rich people who go to that hospital.
Right.
So my first thought was, wow, they still have, like, this place is rich enough they can afford an elevator attendant to push the
Right.
buttons.
Yeah.
Like, but
Right.
no, it totally is a religious thing, and
Wow.
but it's very subtle to know who it is and why they're there or what they're
Mhm.
doing and why.
Yeah.
And it's
Yeah.
only that one day of the week.
Right, right. Well, and that's the giveaway, right? But one of the things that jumped out at me that I hadn't really thought about was there's a passage where she talks about performance, right? And in the section where she's talking about Black people and being whipped, but having to pretend to be happy and dancing and singing and all of that. And then she goes on to say African Americans would later convert the performance role that they were forced to occupy and the talent that they built from it into prominence in entertainment and in American culture disproportionate to the numbers. And she talks about Louis Armstrong and Muhammad Ali and Oprah and Jay-Z and Michael Jordan. And that I was wondering about that because it strikes me that is a potential explanation of that. The other thing about that is those are all individual contributor roles, not organizational roles. right? So it's less, not that it's easier to be Oprah Winfrey or Michael Jordan, but that it's someplace that you can get kind of on your own rather than having to be, kind of rise through the ranks and be the CEO of General Motors or something like that.
Well, even in her case too, Oprah starts out as a journalist and slowly builds platform, and which you can do more easily as a journalist on your own
Right.
before you need agents and attorneys and others to contribute to that piece.
Mm-hmm.
And I think still to this day, there are no African American agents on Oprah's team.
Right.
It's all, cisgender white guys, although I think a majority of those who are on her team, at least agent wise, are identify as gay, although most of them only openly in the last, 15, 20 years.
Right. It was kind of funny. I hadn't realized that, I was off to the side, there's all of this crazy cultural stuff that's going on with, the Blake Lively lawsuit and all of that.
Yeah.
I remember hearing about WWE, which I hadn't really been aware of, and then that was, and now the guy who was running it is no longer running it, right? What's his name's brother?
Yeah.
Yeah, now it'll evade me. It's been in the back of my mind now for a few minutes, but now it just fell out.
Oh, the other thing too that struck me too, because we always like our West Wing mentions, and assuredly it's a cultural thing driven by the fact that it's a white guy writing the show episodes. But I remember there was a scene where Nancy McNally is on the phone with some people on a conference call while she's having a separate conversation with Sam, and she comments that everybody seems to mistake her and think she's a man. She's like, "Oh, is my voice unnaturally deep or something?" This guy like totally doesn't get it. And in the episode on the show, it's done as a gender thing. And probably more likely, if you're reading the subtext, this guy doesn't want to believe a woman is, his boss in the military. So he, potentially is purposefully misgendering me, or at least that's how I would have read it. But now, after considering what's going on here, probably the better reading is the cisgender white guy writer is making that as a point. Whereas if an African American were writing the show, it would be a more subtly racial thing. They're just trying to like sideline me as a general thing because I'm lesser than, I'm in the caste below them. Yet they all report to me.
It might have been a white cisgender guy on the writing team, but in theory, that was still a Aaron Sorkin episode from memory. And Aaron Sorkin's not white; he's Jewish.
Well, I was thinking of Ari Emanuel actually, and he's Jewish too.
Yeah.
Brahms.
Yeah, as in White House chief of staff.
Right. Yeah. The guy who bankrupted Chicago. Yeah. Yeah. But another family, that I should, that in my when I get to the second half of my American history, the families.
Well, and he's not talked about as often too, but there's a third brother who is a very prominent physician who just has not been in the public eye the same way that the other two louder, cantankerous brothers have been.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of it. There's a lot of interesting. I mean, there's a whole history of interesting kind of New York Jewish families as well. The Lehmans and the Loebs and the
and the Bob Moses family.
Yeah. So
mother, although I don't think that became a dynastic generational thing.
Yeah. Well, it's weird though, because there are some that become interesting and dynastic, and there's some that are just that just make for great stories. So yeah, I don't know what I'm going to do with all that. It's interesting stuff, and the point of some of this American history stuff is just to be interesting and to keep people kind of.
Well, I remember in the early chapters on like week 1, you said I kind of wish she would put more of herself into these stories.
Yeah,
I feel like in parts 4 and 5, she does a lot more of that, and it's really illustrative of kind of what's going on, and points to just people's general rudeness.
Yeah,
and kind of dismissiveness within the caste system. And I almost wish there were subtle signals. It's tough to be aware of when you've grown up swimming in the water to understand that it's water that's all around you.
Yeah.
But once you see it, it becomes a little easier to see more of it. But I almost wish there were like cultural cues, like there are hand signals that if you've been kidnapped or being
Oh.
held against your will, you can throw
Right.
down, and usually someone, typically a woman who is aware of this as a thing, will recognize the hand signal and then call the police.
Yeah.
But it's tough to be aware that those things exist to know to watch out for them and then report them or do something with them. But I almost kind of wish there were caste hand signals
Right.
that someone could subtly throw down, then you could then help be a better ally.
Right.
If you're not watching or you're not paying attention, but you see the hand signal and then you start paying attention.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. I like the parts that she inserts about her own experience. I'm not quite as sure that I am sold on the idea of these italicized passages, these kind of examples that, that she gives, because also because they're sort of unsourced. Okay. See you later, Tim. I guess Tim's bailing because he got here 5 minutes early. So,
Oh, yeah.
so,
Yeah,
so
I'm kind of trying to figure out too what those italicized kind of bumpers between sections either mean or what their purpose is.
yeah,
I feel like they're trying to say something, but I'm not exactly sure.
right.
And the first one, even with the picture of the guy not saluting, I kind of get, but I'm not sure
Yeah.
I'm getting what maybe I'm supposed to be getting out of it.
Yeah. Yeah. The implication is that I guess that it's so obvious that there should be no question about it, but I'm not sure that it worked quite that way.
Or that it's, part of it was, here's somebody who's at least got the conviction of their beliefs and has seen it before and knows what's going on. And but it could be just as easily, because we don't know, the guy could have just, and he's not specifically identified. It's possible he could have just been having a shitty off day and I'm so fed up with work, I'm going to sit here and just be non-committal because, and that's the issue. You don't know.
Right. And we read
But
in.
it does make a better story to tell it the way they tell it. No, particularly when you look back with, 2020 hindsight on what happened and what was going on. But if you can't even identify who the actual person was and what their intent was, can you really say one way or the other?
Right.
I don't know.
Yep.
But then the myth becomes more powerful as a symbol for the thing rather than, or in the case, let's say, of the policeman with the dog during the riots in the South in the 50s, there's a policeman pulling a dog and a young African American boy in his teens, who looks like he's being attacked by the dog.
Right.
And that becomes the symbol, that picture becomes a symbol of the fight. When presumably the story, well after the fact, from historians who went back and dug it up, the dog was going at the boy and the policeman was actually trying to prevent the dog from attacking the boy, which is a whole nother, that's a whole different story than the one that picture was used to tell.
Right. Well, and points to other issues, right? Well, why were cops with dogs there? Was it, is this a systemic thing, that the chain of command said, we're sending the canine, contingent in, and this particular cop may have been bought in, may not have been bought in. It's kind of interesting. One of the things that's been on, I think it was on HBO lately, has been this Celtics and Boston series that's going on, and they've been doing it sort of chronologically. So the first episode was Bob Cousy, and then next was Bill Russell, and then next was Cowens, and then I guess the fourth one, which just coming out this week, will be Larry Bird. But my parents, had watched it, and they had said, we didn't know any of that about the Bill Russell era. We didn't know that he was so active. We didn't know that much was going on in Boston during that time, and what a racist place Boston was, and all of that. And they grew up in Newton and Cambridge, and they went to, Boston University and Mass Art, and they lived on Mass Ave, in the 50s. And then, then they moved out in the early 60s, and I was born in upstate New York. But it's, sort of looking at that, and a lot of that busing stuff happens in the 60s and then in the 70s. But
well, it helps too to know the space and the areas, because when you think about it, Newton is kind of an out there bedroom community of the city, but it's also an incredibly wealthy area.
Super wealthy. Yeah.
So it's essentially, when it's the bedroom community, or not only the bedroom community, but it's the Beverly Hills of Massachusetts in some sense.
Yeah.
That totally changes the dynamic of people who don't have the context when you say, oh, they were from Cambridge and Newton,
Right.
is
Yeah. Yeah. Or
Cambridge.
they were, yeah.
Most people might pick up Cambridge as oh, that's where the educated elite are hanging
Yeah.
out.
Yeah. Well, and my dad was from East Cambridge. Yeah. But I mean,
Versus, versus the other side of the city where you're in South, and it's all from
right.
the hat.
Well, and I grew up in Attleboro, so we were a half hour south on 95. And I used to, when I first started driving, the white VW Beetle that they let me drive,
Yeah.
I would drive into Boston and my dad would say, do whatever you do, do not get off in Roxbury. Right. Because that was like the late 70s, going on 1980 when, people were getting pulled out of their cars and beaten to shit.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, growing up in the deep South where the big city was the dangerous place, and it nearly killed my chances of going to Johns Hopkins. We drove through the worst parts of Baltimore at a time when Baltimore was a much more like pre-transitional space.
Mm-hmm.
And then we show up on this, garden of a super secure, lovely campus where it would appear that at least half of my tuition dollars are going to groundskeeping.
Yeah.
My dad was worried, like, oh, this is the big city, like you got to be careful because look at all this danger and blight and
Right.
problematic areas we're driving through. But then suddenly you're on campus and you totally miss it.
Yeah. Yeah.
The choices people might make are dramatically different.
Mm-hmm.
Or my parents come in from out of town and when we drive back from the airport, I take a slightly different route.
Right.
It makes my neighborhood look way better than it may actually be.
Right.
Because I know which neighborhoods to drive through on the way to my neighborhood to make my neighborhood look better than if we came the way I usually
Yep. Yeah, it's funny because and it's interesting how it changes over time because I remember like taking the train down to New York City in the 70s, early 80s when it was a shithole. And and then it became Disneyland. It's weird. So I guess we're going to finish this book next week, right? And then we're going to take a week off and then we got to come up with a next book. I'm not that convinced unless Mark were to come back and he's really, really psyched about it, I guess I would be willing to read Abundance, but it didn't, having glanced at it.
I'd be more interested in reading syntopically one or two of those. Like, what is Klein's version of Abundance versus what is Robin Wall Kimmerer's version of Abundance, and something like. And Surface Berry is a very short book as well, but
that might be fun. That might be something. Given the kind of the brevity of both of them, that might be something to do is compare them.
Or just because I feel dragged down by life in 2025. I totally wouldn't mind going into some like much older history, like pure history something, just for fun and entertainment almost as much as anything, and get away from because we read a lot of kind of heavier sociology, anthropology, like current eventsy type things. I mean, even the anthropology stuff like Graeber it's not only it's dense and it's fun and for what it is, but it also is saying something very heavy about who we are and what we're doing now. I'd rather kind of get away from the now and go back to something else to.
Okay, I could go with
that.
I
don't know what that is. If it's something like, or some other classic that I had delved into bits and pieces of Henry Adams' autobiography, but I've never read it all the way through. But something like that.
That might be fun. Okay.
Or that might also speak to a lot of this other stuff we are always talking about anyway.
Yeah. I'll look at
I don't know. Sometimes it feels like too we're reading a lot of meta material.
Well, it's meta because we've read so many people pointing at the same stuff.
Yeah. But we're not reading the primary documents. Like, you mentioned earlier the, Washington's inaugural address, which I actually think was in the Gateway to the Great Book series, because it got added later as a shorter piece in a bigger anthology versus, the Great Book stuff. But some of those, original source materials rather than what do we draw out of those things and where do we,
Right. Yeah.
And how do we use them now?
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's think about that. Yeah. I'll glance at Henry Adams. That might be fun. I'm not sure if Pat is here or if he's gone off and just left his thing on. You still here, Pat? Okay. Hi.
Or you had camera issues like I did earlier.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So I guess that's it for now then.
Yeah, but we got to think of what comes next and or what's interesting.
Hey, Dan, I don't know if you saw my comment about 400 or 830 some.
800, I did, yeah, the 834, yeah.
How did the French?
Well, I
did
think
they-
it was very catch and release. I think
Did
they,
they sink them, or what did they do?
no, I don't think they held on to them. I think that meant that 834 ships were boarded and, and they took possession, they took control of them on the high seas, probably released some of them immediately, but probably did, abscond with things that they found on them and stuff like that. They didn't do as much. They didn't impress sailors or anything, which is, what's going to happen in the next chapter. The British are going to start doing that like crazy, and that's going to lead to the embargo and the war.
I'm just amazed there are that many ships around.
I was a little bit surprised too. Yeah, because at that point, the U.S. Navy, was one ship. So
So the French must have had somewhat near the same number of ships.
I would imagine that the French Navy was trying. I mean, it was trying to beat the Royal Navy, in Europe and the Mediterranean as well. So I imagine it was probably getting close to the size of the Royal Navy. So, so probably, and it's possible also that 834, I'll double check that number, but I think it may even, I think it was very catch and release, and it may have been, some ships may have been grabbed several times.
Yeah.
Right. Over, if they're sort of, plying the waters between, New England or the mid-Atlantic states and, and Barbados and Jamaica, bringing produce and supplies and things.
Well, the other question too might be, how big were those ships, and what kind of tonnage did they have, and what were their crew sizes? Are they, smaller trade boats? Are they pleasure boats? Are they, is it a small raft with one or two people? And, and what are they considering? Because usually in modern context, you think back and you have this mythical idea of what these ships were and how big they were.
Right.
Versus, have you visited, any of the seaports along the Connecticut Shore and actually seen some of those older wood boats?
Right. Well, and I mean, I've been in old Ironsides, and it's a ship of the line, right? I think it has two levels of guns. Even it is pretty small, but yeah, I should probably, I think you're both right. I should probably maybe do something to explain the size and the, kind of the scale of what we're talking about here.
And the other question is, how do you keep track of how many ships? I mean, there were no telexes or internet, or how do you keep the log? Who kept the log of how many ships somebody captured?
Well, I imagine that the Americans were pretty aggrieved by this, and so, which may have led to exaggeration as well, right? Yeah, that's a good point. But I think that they were probably keeping track of anybody who kind of came in and said that I was, or who made an insurance claim, right? I was carrying, X amount of, of flour to, to Barbados, and I was boarded, and, and it was taken off. So I want my, insurance payment for it. That would be a way, but I don't know.
Or if stuff's being taken away, what's the capacity of those naval ships, and how often do they have to go back to offload whatever it is they took away?
Mm-hmm.
And so you've got a ledger with two sides that you can balance out of what was taken away and how big were the things taking it away, and what was the work on the other end of that.
Mm-hmm.
And do you blockade at the early part of the process, or do you try and catch them just before they're about to offload it?
Right.
A couple days later, you go and offload it, so you don't have to do the extra work, which a good pirate knows how to pull off.
Right. Well, which is interesting. Which is an interesting point too. It also overlaps that period of piracy, kind of the tail end of it. So yeah. I mean, there's a lot of there's a lot of cans of worms open in this one. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Well, I will look into that, and I'll try to add something. I probably won't be able to add it until I kind of come back around to that chapter again, but I'll definitely. It's a kind of a surprisingly large number.
I feel like during the pandemic there was a lot of really good piracy scholarship coming out in book form.
Really?
Versus, I don't know. Ask me why I even know this, but
okay.
I feel like I saw a bunch of pirate scholars who were debunking myths about some broad piracy because they'd actually been able to do some of the heavier research and track down some numbers. So there may be more out there than there was 10 years ago.
All right. Yeah. Cause I didn't look at it during that period, but and I'm familiar with the Marcus Rediker and, all that older stuff, but yeah. I'll ask
Or
Ron.
maybe I dug it up and looked at it too when we were just before we were going into Graeber's
The Pirate Utopia. Yeah.
stuff. Yeah.
Yep. Yep.
So but I know there was some of it that predated that. But
Mhm.
um,
Cool. Yeah.
if you're reading Redeker too, you probably are probably at least as up on it as I am.
Well, I was, actually a couple, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, I had a student at Bemidji State who did his senior thesis on pirates. And he put together a really, really decent presentation on them. He had gotten motivated after watching like Black Sails or something.
Yeah.
I always liked Blackbeard. Blackbeard was sort of my favorite because he operated around the Massachusetts coast for a while. But yeah, he used to be my guy. But in any case, we're over time, so we should probably go.
And when you come back next week, we want to hear a more authentic, like Massachusetts version of you.
Oh God, I don't know if I can even. I'll have to watch.
Guy who lived there, went to Amherst, like.
I'll have to watch. The as far as accents go, I've probably told this story before, but something about Mary is they're actually doing the accent of Brockton. No, it's not Brockton. It's someplace right on the like Fall River or someplace right on the Massachusetts Rhode Island line down near where I lived, and I couldn't, I mean, just the expressions that they're using, like I'm just fucking with you, all that kind of stuff. It was crazy. It blew up my ears. When I heard it, it was like, oh my God, they actually went to the trouble of all learning that thing.
They have the crudest sense of humor, and it gets way worse when you meet them in person. But they're also the type that they would go out and hire locals to get the flavor of what they're going after, but also as a means of making fun of those locals while they're doing it.
Right.
In that sense. So
yeah. I'll watch that. I'll watch something about Mary, or what's that cop movie in Boston?
The Matt Damon,
with Leo.
Matt Damon, Leo, and
and Nicholson. Yeah.
And and the president, who probably has the thickest accent in the whole damn movie.
Right.
Like, total wicked awesome.
Yep. Wicked
Awesome.
Wicked bitches.
You're totally of that generation. You should be able to pull that off, no problem.
Yep. I do still find myself saying things like, "How you doing?" Everybody I see, it's just part of, you say hello, you say, "How are you?" It's like, it's what you do. Yeah. Anyways, ciao.
All right.
See you soon.
Take care, day. Bye.